I'm posting up another midweek episode to keep the holiday mood moving forward. On Sunday, we'll have a new show, but today, we're going back to that pivotal first Christmas at Walt Disney World and how Walt Disney World's first year changed the lives of many people. So, whether you're off to work or out for a walk or driving off to see some loved ones for a special celebration, here's hoping that today's seasonal episode keeps your spirits bright. Let's go.
In the late 1960s and early 1970s, the Disney Company worked through the question as to who would manage Disney World once it was open. During construction and beyond, senior executives at the studio, such as Roy Disney, Card Walker, and Don Tatum, planned to keep their offices at the Disney Studio in Burbank, making only short field trips to Florida every few weeks. Longtime Disneyland management, such as Joe Fowler and Jack Sayers, planned to stay in Anaheim, also making only short trips. Even Dick Nunes, who eventually oversaw park operations, split his time between California and Florida. To manage the new resort, the company initiated a training program designed to promote operations and transportation managers from within frontline ranks. In 1969 and 1970, hourly cast members at Disneyland, typically with some supervisor's experience, could apply for a promotion if they were willing to relocate to Florida. Once an application was accepted, the applicant was given a 2-week trip to Orlando, sometimes with their spouse, to better understand what the change would entail. For the most part, the applicants were young men and women in their late 20s and early 30s who had worked up through operational ranks at Disneyland. Disney legend Tom Nabby recalls his exploratory trip in detail. Quote, "After spending some time in Central Florida, I asked myself some tough questions. Is this where I want to go, and is this where I want to someday raise my kids? Especially considering the lack of cultural opportunities. Orlando back then was an unusual place. The 3 things I best remember about that first trip are these. 1. There was a guy who could swallow whole oranges. 2. You could go out to McCoy Air Force Base and watch all the B-52s take off and then come back and land after a SAT mission. And 3. You could go to Lake Eola and watch the grass grow. Those were the exciting things to do." Another California transplant, Bill Sullivan, put it simply, quote, "Orlando was a depressed area when we came down. There were a lot of packing houses and a lot of orange growers." And after the trip, if the applicant was still willing, they entered into a training program intent on preparing them to be a salaried manager in Florida. Quote, "In May of 1970, Nabby continued, to prepare me for my new role at Disney World, I was promoted to an assistant supervisor of rides and attractions at Disneyland." Many of the people in this program met personally with Roy Disney, the company's financial genius, who had returned to lead the company after considering retirement in the months following Walt's death. But leading the company hadn't been his first plan as to how to manage this transition. As he was nearly 8 years older than Walt when his brother passed, he had already planned his own retirement. At first, Roy tried to convince the president of Bank of America and longtime Disney board member Clark Bees to take the reins of the Disney company. But after Bees, who was also retirement age, turned him down, Roy wasn't sure what to do. For months, he explored other options with family members before finally accepting that leadership duties should fall to a member of the Disney family, to reassure stockholders and partner companies, and also to guide the company into Florida. With this, he accepted the role of president, but he remained focused on retirement, even if that meant putting it off for another 4 or perhaps even 5 years. To this end, he set up a new executive structure within the company to ensure that once Florida opened, he would be able to step away from company work. He promoted Don Tatum, a 10-year Disney veteran with degrees from Stanford and Oxford, to the position of executive vice president, overseeing administrative and financial aspects of the company, and he promoted Card Walker, a man who had worked in various aspects of film production for nearly 30 years, to the position of executive vice president overseeing studio operations. Roy also wanted to ensure that those operations managers moving to the Florida resort felt comfortable and well supported after they relocated on the other side of the continent. When he met with those willing to move to Florida, he promised them, quote, a living wage. He explained that under his watch, the company would help them set up in the new state. Lastly, he promised that for those who did well, that there was the possibility of later advancements. Beyond the meetings, most of those moving to Florida also knew this story. One Disney manager, Bob Matheson, was tasked with arranging a financial support package comparable to that of other major companies for those in the training program willing to move to Florida. Matheson, after doing some research, assembled what he thought was a good package with generous support. But after looking over it, Roy said, no, I want to do more for these people. They're leaving their homes and their friends. In all, Disney would transfer and promote dozens of California cast members as newly trained and minted salaried managers for the Florida resort. Most, if not all, had personal recollections of Walt and remembered the values he wanted to present in the California park. It was the only practical way to bring the service-oriented entertainment culture of the California park to a new location. For most of these Disney transplants, that initial fall season was largely about finishing the park and establishing procedures to create a working resort. Quote, as best I recall, I didn't have a single day off during those first months, Nabby recalls. Many California managers, though not all, moved to a section of Orlando called Windermere, a small community just north of the resort. It was a quiet, sparsely populated residential area filled with Finger Lakes, a few houses situated near the water, and many lots ready to build. In 1971, a single-family lot in Windermere cost around $5,000. Once managers acquired a lot, they then had to build a house, which took months. Quote, I think we had to move in and out of apartments about 5 times, one of the California managers, Ted Kellogg, recalled. These California managers, now in Florida, spent their workdays together. They also spent a lot of their free time when they had it together as well. Quote, there were about 26 of us who came out to work in operations from California, Kellogg explained. One of them oversaw parking, another monorails, another watercraft, and so on. As a group, they became charter members of Club 71, a nickname Disney cast members invented for those who started at the resort during its first year. Together, they tackled the problems of running the world's first vacation kingdom during the years that the vacation kingdom was still inventing itself, and also of figuring out how to form a community of coastal Californians inside of what was then a largely agricultural part of Florida. To make the new resort feel more like home, they wanted to establish some of the holiday traditions from the California park in Florida, particularly the small ceremonies and the employee gatherings. But that first year, they couldn't focus on the holidays as much as they wanted. Even though the opening of Disney World in 1971 progressed smoother than the opening of Disneyland had back in 1955, managers, construction workers, and installation teams were still rushing to finish various attractions during the first few weeks that the Magic Kingdom was open to the public. To get even to this point of preparedness, Roy Disney explained, quote, we have a lot of people, and we've spent twice as much as we originally planned. I'm so grateful that we got to where we are now. I only wish Walt could have been here to enjoy this. But Roy also acknowledged that the resort was not yet running as planned. Quote, we've got a lot of work to do. We'll always have a lot of work to do, he said. November was tentatively marked as the month that the first 230 campsites in Fort Wilderness and the Tri-Circle D Ranch would be ready for guests, with the expectation that another 800 sites would open the following year. Managers hope to finish the Circle Vision Theater in Tomorrowland, sponsored by Monsanto, by Thanksgiving with an updated version of America the Beautiful playing on its circular screen. By Christmas, they hoped that Flight to the Moon, an early space travel simulator, would be ready for guests. Managers also believed that a half dozen or so shops, all behind schedule, would be open for business by the Christmas holidays as well, including the Westward Ho Shop in Frontierland, the Heritage House in Liberty Square, the Confectionery and Candy Shop on Main Street, and the Tinkerbell Toy Shop in Fantasyland. Out on Seven Seas Lagoon, engineers were still testing the wave machine, an early paddle-driven piece of engineering that ideally would be able to send waves from 4 inches to 4 feet curving across the beach at the Polynesian resort. The machine, actually a collection of multiple machines that worked in concert with each other, was designed to direct waves at different speeds towards the beach so they would join in height and power, creating surfable swells. By November 1971, after periods of testing, the wave machine had washed away sand from the resort beach just outside the Poly and had produced swells so powerful as to cause damage to the underwater structures on which they were mounted. The waves also removed vegetation from Beachcomber Isle in the middle of Seven Seas Lagoon. Despite these things, some managers still believed that it would soon, quote, create waves, rolling onto what was then called Surfside Beach. The employee newsletter promised that, quote, surfboards and instructions will be available through the hotel reception desks. Perhaps most importantly, managers hoped that by the holiday season, they'd have more transportation systems to carry guests from the Ticket and Transportation Center over to the Magic Kingdom, as beyond a few small boats, some of which were designed for only low-capacity pleasure cruises, and for monorails, at least one of which was typically out for repair, the resort was using trams designed for a flat surface to carry people from the ticket area up a graded road past the Contemporary over to the Magic Kingdom. Specifically, the transportation staff was hoping that they'd have 2 more monorails on the beam by Christmas. They also hoped to have 2 sidewheel steamboats on the lagoon. The large Staten Island-style ferries, originally called Magic Kingdom 1 and Magic Kingdom 2, and now known as the Admiral Joe Fowler and the Richard F. Irvine, were still part of the distant future. As the resort moved toward Thanksgiving weekend, its first significant holiday, Carl Bongiorno, Disney's director of finance, placed projected daily attendance for Thanksgiving weekend after Thanksgiving Day itself was over, between 21,000 and 25,500 people, with modest to healthy crowds arriving on Friday and growing through the weekend. Quote, very truthfully, Nabby recalls, everyone at that time was wondering if Walt Disney World would generate a profit. Charlie Ridgway, the lead publicist, remembers that privately, Roy Disney too understood the difficulty of the current moment. Quote, Roy told associates, unless we have a full house for Thanksgiving, we're in trouble. At the resort, the actual day of Thanksgiving was a local affair, a way to create a sense of community for cast members, particularly those with extended families in California. The park itself opened for a shortened day, from 10 a.m. to 7 p.m., with no extra entertainment of any kind. For cast members, the actual extra entertainment occurred on TV. A month earlier, on Saturday, October 23rd, the Magic Kingdom had held its official opening ceremony with a world-class symphony conducted by Arthur Fiedler, over 90 minutes of music performed before Cinderella Castle. 6 days later, on Friday, October 29th, a few short highlights of that performance had been shown on the NBC special celebrating the grand opening of Walt Disney World. But as many cast members were unable to see the full performance, they were working after all. The local educational channel, WMFE Channel 24, presented the entire performance for viewers in the Orlando area on Thanksgiving evening. This show would begin at 7 p.m., right when the Magic Kingdom closed, allowing most cast members time to see it either in a break room or at home. At the resort itself, the Friday after Thanksgiving demonstrated that the Magic Kingdom would likely be a success, though the park had opened to unusually small crowds in October. Thanksgiving weekend finally brought crowds far larger than Bongiorno had predicted. On Friday, 57,000 guests swelled into the Magic Kingdom, even though the park offered little in the way of holiday entertainment. On the Tomorrowland Terrace, the park featured a fairly minor band called the Friends of Distinction, a band who, over the course of 2 albums, had only been able to land a single in the 35th slot on the Billboard Top 100. On the other 2 stages, the park featured house bands, and at midnight, the park launched fireworks. Despite the limited holiday entertainment, on both Friday and Saturday, once the parking lot was filled and the Magic Kingdom at maximum capacity, a line of cars stretched all the way out to Highway 192, with thousands more hoping to squeeze into the park as other guests left. Throughout the resort, the crowd surprised managers and swamped hourly cast members. The resort had done far more to promote the Walt Disney World Golf Open, which started on November 29th, than it had to promote Thanksgiving. For the Golf Open, Disney was bringing in film celebrities like Fred MacMurray and Buddy Ebsen and singer Pat Boone. Yet it was Thanksgiving which ultimately overwhelmed the Disney facilities. Quote, "The day after Thanksgiving, we were inundated with people coming to the Magic Kingdom," Nabby explained. "The amount of guests far exceeded the theoretical maximum of guests in the park and far exceeded space in the parking lots." Despite the problems of overcrowding, Dick Nunes was so satisfied with the attendance numbers that around noon, he called Roy Disney in California to report that they were forced to close the front gates to new arrivals. "Sir," Nunes said over the phone, "I just want you to know we closed at 10 o'clock today." "Really?" Roy said. "You're kidding." By now, Roy was again looking toward a new retirement date, perhaps in a year, when he could finally ease away from the company, likely in stages. At 78, he was still reasonably active, despite minor pains and some issues, likely related to the stress of overseeing the Florida project. In recent days, he'd experienced a fogginess in his vision. He'd seen a doctor, but didn't think the matter was serious. It was, he likely assured himself, just another sign of age. On the phone with Nunes, he was pleased that the Friday attendance numbers were so strong, a sign, hopefully, that the resort was now on the right path. He planned to return to Florida to review changes to the property firsthand, quote, after the Christmas holidays. One lesson of Thanksgiving for Disney managers was simple. They needed to hire more hourly cast members. During the previous summer, when mapping out the year, they believed they could staff the resort with 6,000 employees, about a few hundred salaried managers and the rest hourlies. By October, that number had been raised to a projected pool of 7,200 cast members, a goal that they didn't reach before Thanksgiving weekend. After Thanksgiving, they believed that they'd need a total of 8,300 cast members to handle the Christmas crowds. That is, they wanted to hire an additional 1,700 employees, hopefully before December 18th, due to expanded operating hours and increased attendance. One ad to cast members read, quote, "Tell your neighbors and friends they can apply in person from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. Most everyone who applied was hired. As for the other obvious problem, parking, managers put together a 2-stage plan. For the coming winter holidays, parking lot attendants would direct guests to park on unpaved ground. Once the holiday was over, they would move toward expanding the parking lot so it could hold an additional 3,000 cars. For the first 2 weeks of December, the park remained empty, with few signs of the coming holiday season. As the park didn't yet have a dedicated decorations team, managers and hourly employees together put up holiday decorations down Main Street. And to officially start the winter festivities, managers brought in one of the most unique celebrations from the California resort, the Candlelight Processional, an event focused on the religious story of Christmas. It would be a new experience for Florida locals, but it would make the Californians feel more like they were back home. The story of Christmas would be presented at the park on Saturday and Sunday, December 18th and 19th. With a full orchestra and choir, Santa and the holiday parade wouldn't arrive until the 20th. To create the Candlelight Processional, the Disney team looked to replicate the well-received musical event at Disneyland, only with minor adjustments as to where the event would be staged. At Disneyland, the entertainment team had asked local university music professors to oversee the choir and symphony. They would do the same in Florida, asking Dr. Frederick Fennell, conductor at the University of Miami, to manage the musical portions of the program. Disney also recruited a Hollywood celebrity to narrate, just as they did in California. In 1971, they invited Rock Hudson, who had previously narrated the event at Disneyland, to be the first celebrity narrator in Florida. High school, college, and community choirs were invited from across the state to create a massed choir that during the processional would stretch across Main Street. On Saturday, December 18th, the same day that Disneyland began its two-night processional, choir members in Florida were asked to show up at the Magic Kingdom parking lot no later than 2 p.m. for a 2:30 backstage rehearsal behind Main Street. For opening night, 1,268 singers came to Disney World to be part of the inaugural performance. Though individual choirs had practiced on their own for weeks, the resort held only one group rehearsal that lasted for roughly 2.5 hours to finalize the program. Choirs were arranged backstage in files exactly as they would be arranged in the performance areas beneath the castle. The massive choir practiced moving on the mock stage, singing the numbers, and then moving off stage. Once they were finished, choir members in their own school or community robes lined up behind Town Square to receive matching white collars to unify their appearance. They were also given candles. As opposed to the Disneyland version, which started at the hub and moved up to the elevated Main Street station, the Disney World version that first year moved performers in the exact opposite direction. On December 18th at 6 p.m., with the lights turned low on Main Street, singers moved out from Town Square past the 50-foot tree trucked in from Paradise, Michigan, ornamented with 1,000 lights and flocked with artificial snow. The first performance began with Dickens-era carolers and grew as the choir members joined beneath the darkened castle. The final musical element was 100 boys each wearing a green robe, arranged on tiered stands to form a living Christmas tree. The boys came from choirs in Orlando and St. Petersburg. Once the music was brought low, the voice of Jack Wagner, the official announcer for Disneyland in California, appeared on the PA system to introduce actor Rock Hudson. Sporting a newly grown handlebar mustache, Hudson stepped before a lit podium and looked out at the crowd, a group of East Coasters who were experiencing, likely for the first time, the story of Christ mixed with California notes of spectacle. One reporter would later describe the evening as unusually brisk, with, quote, a cold frost sweeping through the state, bringing temperatures down into the 60s, with occasional gusts of wind making it seem colder. As the cool air moved around them, the audience watched as Hudson continued section by section to narrate the story of Christmas. Another reporter noted that despite the appearance of an actual celebrity, the light and sound cues kept the program focused on the story. Quote, Hudson's dignity and his refusal to play the big-time star contributed too, the reporter added. And during long musical passages, when the spotlight was not on him, he turned away from the audience as if to focus attention elsewhere. At the end of the performance, Hudson invited the crowd to sing, along with the choir, the Hallelujah chorus from Handel's Messiah. as major chords swelled up from the orchestra. As lines of ascending notes lifted from the choir, the crowd with their untrained voices gradually united in the song as the melody, over 200 years old, stretched across the center of the Magic Kingdom. It was a moment that united many things: popular culture with high art, the presentation of religious stories into the realm of fairy tales, celebrities and their audience, and of course, the traditions of the California resort with the new location opened in the South. Once the program ended, thousands remained as the orchestra continued to play holiday songs. By this point, the resort was beginning to settle into a successful first holiday season, with crowds swelling in the days leading up to Christmas. Though in years past in California, Disneyland had held the Candlelight Processional on multiple nights leading into Christmas Eve, by 1971, it had focused its performance down to 2 nights, typically a week or so before the actual holiday. As the same pattern was repeated in Florida, at the end of Saturday night's processional, cast members cleaned the stage and arranged elements for the following day's performance. The next morning in California, Roy Disney thought that he and his wife Edna might take 3 of their grandchildren out to Disneyland for its Christmas celebration. Roy's offer, in part, was to relieve the burden of childcare from his own son, who was watching over the 4th grandchild, Roy Patrick, who had recently fallen and seriously injured himself and was in the hospital. But that Sunday, after he got out of bed, Roy wasn't fully himself, with some of that recent fogginess again swelling up inside of him. He dressed, he got his coat and even his hat, but then he paused. "I don't feel like going down there," he told his wife. "I don't think I'll go." Even at the age of 78, it was unlike him not to follow through with a social commitment. Even though he was working toward retirement, he still went to the studio 5 days a week. After explaining himself to his wife Edna, he undressed and returned to bed. Without him, Edna made arrangements to take the grandchildren to the park with their son, while their daughter-in-law Patty stayed at home in case her injured son needed her. Patty also agreed to check in on Roy by phone. She called twice to see how he was doing. Both times, through a tone of annoyance, Roy said he was fine. Over at the park, amongst the decorations and crowds, Edna felt a sense of unease come down around her for leaving her husband alone for so long. She promised her grandkids that she'd stay for the parade, but after that, she wanted to return home. At about the same time, in Florida, cast members prepared for the second performance of the processional. On Sunday, the choir was significantly smaller, with only 775 members. At 6 p.m., choral singers again moved down Main Street to the castle forecourt, where under a clear sky, they performed the gospel story in reading and song. As this was the final performance, the boys' choir, once the processional was over, walked over to the Contemporary Hotel, where they sang Christmas carols in the north end of the Grand Canyon Concourse. Behind them was one of the most spectacular displays at the resort, the Contemporary Christmas tree. Floating rings of silver and gold nearly 9 stories high, arranged into the narrowing shape of a tree. It was a cascade of tinsel, topped with a space-age brass and aluminum star that appeared vaguely like a satellite. The space-age wonder didn't rise like a traditional tree, with boughs attached to an interior pole, but was hung with aircraft cables layer by layer, from the top of the A-frame lobby and dressed with strips of mylar, giving it an otherworldly postmodern sheen, a tree that suggested hope in the near future. Festivities at the Contemporary ended around 9 p.m., just as across Seven Seas Lagoon, the Magic Kingdom closed for the night. Across the continent, around the same time, Edna returned home with her son and 3 of her grandchildren to find the house quiet, with no signs to suggest that Roy had even taken lunch. One of the grandchildren was the first to find him, disoriented, lying on the floor next to his bed, having fallen there. When Edna stepped into the room, he said accusingly, "I called you, and you didn't come." Together, the family lifted Roy back into his bed. But once there, he appeared to draw deeper into a pool of confusion, deeper into himself. He was taken to St. Joseph's, the same hospital where Walt had spent his final days, directly across the street from the Disney studio. The next morning, in Florida, the Magic Kingdom began its full holiday celebration, with Santa dancing Christmas trees, prancing reindeer, and babes in Toyland marching soldiers. As at Disneyland in California, the Christmas parade was only offered over the school holidays, the 2 weeks that now stretched until January 2nd. From that first performance, the park attracted large crowds, starting at around 40,000 people a day, a very healthy business, so much so, managers knew that despite the aggressive hiring strategies, they still needed to expand out their workforce. As nearly everyone was working, none of the young California transplants yet knew about Roy's condition. Connected to life support systems, Roy was still alive, but by Monday night, the family knew that due to a massive brain hemorrhage, he was brain dead and that there was no hope for recovery. He died at 11:45, less than 3 months after opening the Florida resort, in a hospital room not far from where 5 years earlier, his younger brother Walt had died. He had spent his last days working and still planning out his retirement. In Florida, the news hit the resort managers hard, as Roy, despite his age, had appeared strong and healthy during the lengthy run-up to the opening of the park. To its employees, Walt Disney Productions released the following note, quote, "It was Roy's wish at the time of Walt's passing that Disneyland remain open. The Disney family feels that Roy would have the same desire." In papers, reporters eulogized Roy in columns and articles, though less so than his brother Walt. Charlie Wadsworth in the Orlando paper wrote, quote, "Until plans for Walt Disney World were put into motion, not too many people were aware that Walt Disney even had a brother named Roy. That is the way Roy Disney wanted it. He preferred to remain in the background, to do his work behind the scenes. It was Roy Disney's guidance and leadership that brought Walt Disney World to its opening. He was completely dedicated to building the dreams of his brother, Walt." Longtime Disney employees understood that the era of the Disney brothers was now over. Other men and women would eventually rise within the company to take their place. But the Florida managers also understood this, that one of their biggest offenders, the person who demanded that the company treat its employees, especially those willing to move across the country, better than would other companies, was now gone. Tom Nabby recalls, quote, "Bob Matheson holding a special staff meeting and informing everyone of Roy's passing. The Florida managers would need to move forward without either of the Disney brothers, relying on executives like Don Tatum, Card Walker, and Walt's son-in-law, Ron Miller, to take his place. The Florida managers would also need to rely more on themselves and their ability to make a future for themselves and for the resort in Florida." As December moved through the holiday season, park attendance continued to climb. After Christmas, attendance hovered at around 50,000 people most days. The peak for the year occurred on December 29th, with 69,458 people crowded into the Magic Kingdom, forcing management once again to restrict entrance to the park. Many park managers overseeing recently hired hourly cast members from Florida grew frustrated as the new hires didn't yet have the skills to handle capacity crowds. But even here, managers could point them as a means of encouragement to the generosity of the company, the remnants of a culture once overseen by Roy. All hourly employees who had completed a 30-day trial period would receive a paid holiday for both Christmas and New Year's. If they worked on either holiday, they would then receive their paid holiday time plus time and a half for any shift worked. If they worked more than 8 hours, they would receive double time. It was an incentive designed to engender loyalty, to inspire even recently trained employees to help solve problems at the new resort. That first year, managers at Disney World were only partially successful in transferring their old California customs to the Florida resort. For example, they were able to schedule an employee party for all families in Fantasyland, which was a long-time custom at the park in California. But they weren't able to hold a Disneyland-style Christmas dance for employees, which was another long-time custom. Most of them were focused entirely on making sure the resort moved forward as a success. Quote, "We were away from California," Tom Nabby recalls, "the state where I'd grown up. I myself was becoming a company man." In their rare free time, the group from California found activities they enjoyed, with many taking to boating and fishing. Quote, "There were plenty of things to do," Sully later admitted, "but it was different than in California." Once the holiday season was done, at the beginning of 1972, as managers looked out at the Magic Kingdom, they could see a park that was now nearly finished, with only a few areas still under construction. They had weathered the first massive holiday season, one that tested the limits of the resort's facilities, also tested the limits of their own abilities as managers. They had brought many traditions from California to Florida, but they hadn't brought all of them. They would work on that next year, perhaps instituting a Christmas dance, perhaps other things as well. And in years after that, once they had a better feel for the largeness of the property, for the East Coast audience, for the direction the company would now take, they might find ways to establish new traditions, ones that would speak directly to the local population, to the type of visitors the resort would attract, and most importantly, to the needs of those men and women who had left California and now called the Sunshine State their home.
I'll be back on Sunday with a new episode.
As you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us on Bandcamp as monthly supporters. On Bandcamp, you'll find over 200 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can become a monthly supporter at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. So until then, this is Todd James Pierce wishing you and your family a very happy holiday season.